The gastrointestinal tract has intrinsic and extrinsic innervation. The intrinsic component is the enteric nervous system, and the extrinsic component is the sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation, which come from the central nervous system. The enteric nervous system can function independently to control digestive activities, which is why it's sometimes called the second brain. So the parasympathetic input basically enhances digestion, and sympathetic input inhibits digestion. From the esophagus to the anus, the walls of the gastrointestinal tract are lined by the same 4 layers of tissue. The outermost layer is either the adventitia, a thick fibrous connective tissue, or the serosa, a slippery serous membrane. Next is the muscularis externa, a smooth muscle layer which contracts automatically without you even having to think about it. And if we look closer at this muscle layer, it's actually composed of an inner circular muscle layer arranged in circular rings which contract and constrict the tract behind the food, which keeps it from moving backwards. While the outer longitudinal muscle layer, arranged along the length of the tract, relaxes and lengthens and therefore pulls things forward. Together, they perform what's called peristalsis, which is a series of coordinated wave-like muscle contractions that help squeeze the food bolus in one direction. In specific places along the tract, like the esophageal sphincter, the circular layer thickens, forming sphincters that keep food from passing from one part of the gastrointestinal tract to the next. The next layer is the submucosa, which consists of a dense layer of tissue that contains blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves. Finally, there's the inner lining of the intestine called the mucosa, which secretes mucus and digestive enzymes because this is the layer that comes into direct contact with food. The enteric nervous system is found within the walls of the entire gastrointestinal tract and is made up of 2 different plexuses. The submucosal or Meissner's plexus is found in the submucosa, and the myenteric or Auerbach's plexus is found within the muscularis externa, between the longitudinal muscle layer and the circular muscle layer. Each plexus is a web-like formation of neurons that expands throughout the gastrointestinal tract. This web is composed of ganglia, which are collections of neurons, and for each ganglion, there are multiple interneurons that connect the ganglia to other ganglia. Some interneurons even travel from the submucosal plexus to the myenteric plexus to connect the ganglia of the 2. You can think of ganglia like dense cities connected by highways. Now, when we eat something, it gets chewed up and enters the gastrointestinal tract. As it works its way through, the food distends the walls of the tract, which stimulates mechanoreceptors in the muscularis externa and the mucosa. The food also increases the levels of protein, fat, and sugar in the gastrointestinal tract, which stimulates chemoreceptors in the mucosa. Both mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors send afferent information through axons that synapse with ganglia in the submucosal plexus. The information then travels through the plexus from ganglion to ganglion via interneurons. The submucosal ganglia then send signals through efferent fibers that stimulate various glands and enteroendocrine cells that help with digestion and absorption. These ganglia also cause blood vessels to vasodilate, and that increases blood flow to the gastrointestinal tract. The ganglia in the myenteric plexus are in charge of gastric motility, and they send signals through efferent fibers to the smooth muscles within the circular and longitudinal layers. This causes an increase in the number and strength of peristaltic contractions. Overall, this is referred to as a short reflex, because both the afferent and efferent components are mediated by the enteric nervous system. Now, the central nervous system can also receive afferent information from and send efferent information to the gastrointestinal tract via sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. And this is called the long reflex. When the body is in rest and digest mode, the parasympathetic nervous system is active and it enhances digestion. When the body is in fight or flight mode, the sympathetic nervous system is active and it inhibits digestion. In the parasympathetic reflex, the vagus nerve carries afferent sensory information that comes from the upper esophagus to the first third of the transverse colon and sends that information to the medulla, where the information is processed. Afferent sensory information from the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, from the distal 2/3 of the colon to the rectum, gets carried by the pelvic nerve to the spinal cord. Efferent parasympathetic stimulation travels along the vagus and pelvic nerve, back towards the respective regions of the gastrointestinal tract. The preganglionic fibers synapse with the parasympathetic ganglia within the myenteric and submucosal plexus, and they secrete acetylcholine to stimulate the ganglia. These ganglia send out postganglionic fibers, which secrete either acetylcholine or neuropeptides like substance P or vasoactive intestinal peptides to stimulate smooth muscles, glands, and enteroendocrine cells. In the sympathetic system, afferent fibers carry signals from the chemo and mechanoreceptors to one of the four sympathetic ganglia, either the celiac, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, or hypogastric ganglia. These ganglia then send afferent fibers along the greater, lesser, and lumbar splanchnic nerves to the spinal cord where the information is processed. Preganglionic efferent fibers leave the spinal cord and synapse with one of the sympathetic ganglia where they release acetylcholine. These ganglia send efferent fibers to smooth muscles, glands, and enteroendocrine cells, just like in the parasympathetic system, except they release norepinephrine, which inhibits the target tissue. Now, let's take a closer look at smooth muscle contraction in the gastrointestinal tract. First, there are two types of muscle contraction. Tonic contractions are continuous, while phasic contractions are the ones where the smooth muscles contract and relax in waves, which causes peristalsis. Interstitial cells of Cajal, or just Cajal cells, in the myenteric plexus act like pacemaker cells in the heart. Cajal cells generate rhythmic depolarization and repolarization of the cell membrane, called slow-wave potentials, without any external stimulation from the neural or endocrine system. The depolarization of Cajal cells is caused by the opening of slow sodium channels in the cell membrane, which causes an influx of sodium ions, while repolarization is caused by the opening of potassium channels, which allows an efflux of potassium. Cajal cells are connected to smooth muscle cells via gap junctions, which allows the slow-wave potential to travel through the smooth muscle, triggering voltage-gated calcium channels to open, sparking depolarization of the smooth muscle cells. Now, slow-wave potentials cause relatively weak depolarizations, which don't reach the threshold potential needed to cause peristaltic contractions. However, they are strong enough to cause weak tonic contraction, which maintains the tone of the gastrointestinal tract. Now, action potentials from the extrinsic nervous system also cause depolarization of the smooth muscle cells by opening up a different set of voltage-gated calcium channels. When these extrinsically triggered depolarizations are combined with the slow-wave depolarizations, it reaches the threshold potential needed to trigger peristaltic contractions. So basically, slow-wave potentials from the enteric nervous system cause tonic contractions, while slow-wave potentials plus action potentials from the extrinsic nervous system cause peristaltic contractions. The number of action potentials on top of each slow wave correlates to the strength of the contraction. That means that the extrinsic innervation of the gastrointestinal tract can modify the strength of each contraction, but the rate of the contraction is determined by the rate of the slow waves. Different sections of the gastrointestinal tract have their own unique slow wave frequency. For example, the stomach has the lowest rate at about 3 slow waves per minute, whereas the duodenum has the highest rate at 12 slow waves per minute. Alright, as a quick recap, the enteric nervous system, also called the intrinsic nervous system, can operate autonomously. But it's affected by the parasympathetic nervous system, which promotes digestion, and the sympathetic nervous system, which inhibits it. Slow waves from the enteric nervous system cause the tonic contraction of the gastrointestinal tract, whereas the peristaltic contractions require both the slow wave and the extrinsic innervation. Slow waves determine the rate of contraction, but the extrinsic innervation can modify the strength of contraction.
When we eat, food enters the mouth, where it's chewed up by the teeth into a smaller, soft mass called the food bolus. The bolus is then pushed by the tongue into the pharynx, and continues to travel down through the esophagus, squeezed by an involuntary movement called peristalsis, until it reaches the stomach. So, the esophagus is a muscular tube that runs vertically downwards and carries food from the pharynx to the stomach. In an adult, it's about 25 centimeters long and can be divided into three regions. First is the cervical region, where it connects with the pharynx behind the trachea. Separating the pharynx and the cervical region of the esophagus is the upper esophageal sphincter, which is a muscular ring that contracts and relaxes to control the entrance of food into the esophagus. Below the cervical region is the thoracic region, that starts at the level of the suprasternal notch and ends when the esophagus goes down through the diaphragm via an opening called the esophageal hiatus. And finally, there's the abdominal region, which starts at the esophageal hiatus and ends where the esophagus connects to the stomach. Separating the abdominal region and the stomach is the lower esophageal sphincter, also known as the gastroesophageal sphincter, which relaxes to let food into the stomach. Now, because most of the esophagus is located inside the thorax, the intraesophageal pressure is equal to the intrathoracic pressure, and both of these pressures are higher than abdominal pressure. This means that food in the esophagus gets pulled toward the area with lower pressure, kind of like how dirt gets pulled into a vacuum. So the upper and lower esophageal sphincters have to stay contracted to prevent air from entering the digestive tract and altering that pressure gradient. In addition, the lower esophageal sphincter also prevents stomach acids from entering the esophagus. The esophagus receives most of its nerve supply through two sources. There's extrinsic innervation by the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10, and there's also an intrinsic plexus of neurons located inside the walls of the esophagus, called the enteric nervous system. Now, if we take a closer look at a cross-section, we can see that, like other parts of the gastrointestinal tract, the esophagus has four layers. The outermost layer is the adventitia, a thick fibrous connective tissue that differs from the serosa, which is the slippery serous membrane that surrounds the walls of the stomach and the intestines. Next is the muscularis externa, composed of an outer longitudinal layer and an inner circular muscle layer that's thicker in the upper and lower parts of the esophagus to form the esophageal sphincters. Now, between the two muscle layers, there's a plexus, or network of nerves, called the myenteric or Auerbach's plexus, which help coordinate muscle contraction and relaxation. Following the muscular layer is the submucosa, which is a dense layer of connective tissue that contains blood vessels, lymphatics, and mucus glands that secrete mucus which travels to the lumen through ducts, and along with saliva swallowed with food, helps lubricate the surface to ease the passage of food downwards. Now, buried in the submucosa, there's also a second nerve plexus, the submucosal plexus, also called the Meissner's plexus, which helps control the size of blood vessels and secretion of mucus, and together with the myenteric plexus form the enteric nervous system. Finally, there's the inner lining of the esophagus, called the mucosa, which itself consists of three cell layers. The outermost layer is the muscularis mucosa or muscularis interna, and it's a layer of longitudinal smooth muscle. The middle layer is the lamina propria, which is mainly composed of connective tissue. Finally, there's the epithelial layer that covers the inner surface of the esophagus and comes in direct contact with food. So, swallowing starts with the oral phase and the voluntary movement of the tongue that pushes the food bolus backwards into the pharynx. This starts the swallowing reflex. First, mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and taste receptors in the pharynx and upper esophagus detect the food. These receptors send afferent sensory information through the trigeminal, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerve to the medulla, where there's a region called the swallowing center that controls the involuntary phases of swallowing. Next, the swallowing center sends efferent motor information, mainly through the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves, to the muscles of the pharynx and the upper esophagus. And this causes the upper esophageal sphincter to relax, allowing the food bolus to pass through. Then the upper esophageal sphincter closes to prevent food from refluxing back into the pharynx. The swallowing reflex also triggers peristalsis, which is a series of coordinated wave-like muscle contractions that help squeeze the food bolus toward the stomach. The first wave is called the primary peristaltic wave, and it starts when the bolus reaches the esophagus. So peristalsis starts in the muscularis externa when the inner circular muscle layer in the esophagus above the bolus contracts and squeezes the bolus downwards. At the same time, the outer longitudinal muscle layer in the part of the esophagus right below the bolus relaxes and lengthens, and therefore pulls the bolus downward. Now, if you're swallowing when standing or sitting, the passage of the bolus is also assisted by gravity. So as the food is coming closer to the abdominal region and the lower esophageal sphincter, its presence is detected by mechanoreceptors and chemoreceptors located in the mucosal layer. These receptors send afferent sensory information through the vagus nerve to the medulla. Next, the medulla responds by sending efferent information through the vagus nerve, which releases the neurotransmitter vasoactive intestinal peptide, or VIP, within the lower esophageal sphincter. The VIP directly inhibits the action of the inner circular muscle layer, causing the sphincter to relax so food can pass into the stomach. Then the lower esophageal sphincter closes to prevent food or stomach acids from refluxing back into the esophagus. Sometimes, though, the primary peristaltic wave is not strong enough to push all of the food into the stomach. So the food particles left behind cause distension of the esophageal wall, which is detected by mechanoreceptors located in the mucosal layer. These receptors send afferent sensory information to the enteric nervous system and the myenteric plexus. The myenteric plexus responds by coordinating muscle contractions above the distension and relaxation below it. This initiates a secondary peristaltic wave that pushes any remaining food into the stomach, just like the primary peristaltic wave. Depending on the individual and size of the bolus, the primary peristaltic wave typically travels at around 3 centimeters per second. So with solid food, it usually takes about 10 seconds to push it from the cervical region to the stomach. Alright, as a quick recap. The entrance and exit of the esophagus are guarded by the upper and lower esophageal sphincters, which are usually closed to prevent air or stomach acid from entering the esophagus. During swallowing, food in the pharynx and upper esophagus stimulates an involuntary contraction, called peristalsis. So a primary peristaltic wave travels the esophagus and pushes food down. But if there's some food that remains in the esophagus, then it's cleared through by a secondary peristaltic wave, which is mainly controlled by the enteric nervous system. When we eat food, it's first chewed up in the mouth and mixes with saliva to form a mushy mass called a bolus. And then it travels down a muscular tube called the esophagus. Next, it enters the stomach through the lower esophageal sphincter, which is a ring of muscles surrounding an opening. The stomach has 3 main parts: the fundus, the body, and the antrum. The body is further divided into a proximal portion and a distal portion. The fundus and proximal body make up the orad region, or top half of the stomach. The distal body and the antrum make up the caudad region, or bottom half of the stomach. Once the food bolus is partially digested in the stomach, it's called chyme, and it passes through the pyloric sphincter and into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. The pancreas is connected to the duodenum through the pancreatic duct, and it secretes many digestive enzymes to further break down food. All these parts play a role in gastric motility, which is the contraction of the stomach to break up food and move it into the intestine. Like other parts of the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach has 4 layers. Starting from the innermost layer to the outermost layer, these layers are the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. The mucosa and muscularis externa layers are modified in the stomach. The mucosa contains various glands filled with different cells that secrete the components of gastric juice. In the body of the stomach, there are parietal cells that secrete hydrochloric acid, or HCl, which is a strong acid that helps to break down protein, and chief cells that secrete pepsinogen, an inactive enzyme. When pepsinogen is exposed to hydrochloric acid, it activates to become pepsin, an enzyme that helps break down proteins. In the antrum, there are mucus cells which secrete mucus, which protects the stomach lining from the acidic environment. There are also G cells, which secrete a hormone called gastrin. Unlike the other secretions, gastrin is not secreted into the stomach lumen, but instead it's released into the bloodstream, where it can reach the basolateral surface of other stomach cells, which is the cell surface that faces the blood. Gastrin increases the hydrochloric acid secretion of the parietal cells. It increases pepsinogen secretion by the chief cells, and it also increases the contraction of the stomach muscles. The next layer is the submucosa, and is mainly made up of connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves, which supply the mucosa. The nerves in the submucosa branch out and connect with one another, forming the submucosal plexus of nerves which actually stretch throughout the gastrointestinal tract. In the stomach, the submucosal plexus regulates gastric secretions of various glands and controls blood flow to the stomach. Next, there's the muscularis externa layer of the stomach, which contains 3 layers of smooth muscle that involuntarily contract in waves called peristalsis. These waves of peristalsis help the stomach mix, digest, and empty the food that it's received. The 3 muscular layers include an outer longitudinal layer, a middle circular layer, and inner oblique layer, which is unique to the stomach. This extra layer of inner oblique muscles provide more forceful contraction in the stomach. In addition, the thickness of the muscular layers increases as you go from the orad region to the caudad region, and that helps push food toward and past the pyloric sphincter. Innervation of these muscles is from the myenteric plexus, which lies between the circular and longitudinal muscle layers. Both the myenteric and submucosal plexuses make up the enteric nervous system, which can function autonomically without input from the central nervous system, and is often called the second brain because of how many interconnected nerves there are. In fact, the myenteric and submucosal plexuses contain just as many neurons as the spinal cord. In addition, they're connected to the central nervous system. They receive parasympathetic input through the vagus nerve, which increases gastric secretion and motility, and sympathetic input through nerve fibers from the celiac ganglion, which inhibits those functions. Finally, the outermost layer is the serosa, which is a thin, slippery membrane that surrounds the entire gastrointestinal tract, kind of like the casing around a sausage. When food travels down the esophagus toward the stomach, it's propelled downwards by peristalsis, gravity, and the lower pressure in the abdominal cavity. When food reaches the distal part of the esophagus, it triggers a process called receptive relaxation. That's where food distends the esophagus, and that's detected by mechanoreceptors in the muscularis externa layer of the distal esophagus. Next, the mechanoreceptors relay that information up to the brain via the vagus nerve. Once the brain processes that information, a motor signal is sent back down the vagus nerve to the myenteric plexus. The nerves in the myenteric plexus secrete a neurotransmitter called vasoactive intestinal peptide, or VIP, which cause the smooth muscles in the esophagus and the orad region of the stomach to relax. This relaxation lets the food through, and it's received by the stomach, hence the term receptive relaxation. Once food has entered the stomach, it distends the stomach, and this is sensed by receptors in the submucosa called mechanoreceptors, which triggers the release of gastrin from the G cells in the stomach. Gastrin promotes the secretion of hydrochloric acid from parietal cells and pepsinogen from chief cells, as well as increased contraction of the stomach muscles. Similar to the esophagus, the stomach has waves of peristalsis that start near the lower esophageal sphincter and move toward the pyloric sphincter. This motion is initially just a gentle ripple, but it becomes more powerful due to the thick muscular walls of the caudad region of the stomach. The enteric nervous system regulates the rate that the stomach contracts, and it's typically about 4 contractions per minute. When food reaches the stomach, the rate remains the same, but the force of the contraction increases. These contractions break apart food into particles that are about 1 millimeter in size so that they can pass through the pyloric sphincter. Any larger particles get pushed back into the body of the stomach, a process called repulsion, so that they can be further broken down. Once the food has been broken down, it moves into the duodenum. Gastric emptying usually happens in a few hours, and it varies a bit depending on the stomach contents. Liquids empty faster than solids, and lipids that contain lots of calories, like juices, empty slower than liquids like water. Another factor is the amount of food eaten and the volume of content in the stomach. Eating a single chip with salsa won't distend the stomach very much, so the stimulus for gastric motility is relatively small, meaning that the chip might hang out in the stomach for a while. On the flip side, eating 3 burritos will distend the stomach quite a bit, and that'll also slow down gastric emptying since there's a lot to break down. Like most things, the most efficient gastric emptying takes place somewhere in between. Foods high in fat also slow down gastric emptying, and that's because fat stimulates release of the hormone cholecystokinin, or CCK, from eye cells of the mucosa of the duodenum. CCK binds to its receptors on the stomach to slow down the rate of gastric emptying by decreasing stomach contractions so that there's enough time for fat to be digested and absorbed in the small intestine. Acidic substances containing lots of protons also slow down gastric emptying. And that's because hydrogen ion receptors in the duodenal mucosa detect the high concentration of protons in the chyme and send that information to gastric smooth muscle cells through interneurons in the myenteric plexus. This slows down the delivery of gastric contents to the duodenum and ensures enough time for neutralization of the protons by pancreatic bicarbonate. This neutralization of duodenal contents is necessary for pancreatic enzymes to work in the duodenum. Alright, as a quick recap, gastric motility is made up of 3 main events. Receptive relaxation, where the ORAD and esophageal sphincter relax to let food into the stomach. Mixing and digestion, where food is broken down by gastric acid, enzymes, and the contraction of the stomach. And gastric emptying, where food leaves the stomach and goes into the duodenum.